Well, dear ones, our guest speaker today, Bryn Saito, is a fourth-generation Korean-American and Japanese-American poet and writer who was born and raised in Fresno, and in fact lived very close to where this congregation is and knows Alluvial Avenue well. You may have seen her jogging along it. Her work and writing explore her family's history, in particular, the legacies of the World War II era incarceration of the Japanese immigrant and Japanese American community. Bryn is the author of 2 chapbooks and 3 collections of poetry, including, most recently, Under a Future Sky, published in 2023. She also co-edited the anthology, The Gate of Memory, Poems by Descendants of Nikkei, Wartime Incarceration, which will be published in a few months, in April. Bryn teaches in the English department and creative writing at MFA program at Fresno State. Let us give a warm welcome to Bryn Saito.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Tim. It's such an honor to be here today, and thank you for all of you for welcoming me here this morning. Thank you to Ruth, my colleague, for setting up this connection today. I grew up attending the United Japanese Christian Church here in Clovis, and also was connected into the Buddhist church in Reedley through my father's side. So religion and spirituality have been sort of woven through my life in these deep ways, but I don't often have a chance to sort of talk about it. So it's just a gift to be able to share some of that with you today. I want to begin by summoning my grandparents and their stories. Alma Ternishi Saito and Mitsuo Saito, my father's parents, whose own parents immigrated from Kumamoto and Hiroshima in Japan at the turn of the 20th century, and made their way, somehow, miraculously, to the Central Valley towns of Reedley and Parlier. My mother's parents, Marilyn Song Oh and Samuel Oh, were born in Dinuba, part of a small but hardy Korean-American community whose elders fled the brutal Japanese occupation in Korea at the turn of the 20th century, fleeing to the US for their survival. We are, all of us, descended from people who survived. In 1942, with the decree of Executive Order 9066, my Japanese-American grandparents, in their early 20s at the time, and unknown to one another, were forced from their homes and incarcerated in the desert of southern Arizona as part of the mass incarceration of over 150,000 Nikkei, people of the Japanese diaspora, living on the west coasts of North and South America. On the train to camp, they packed us in like sardines. My grandmother, who was living with us at the time, told me, her face twisted with shame and rage. That's the one memory I have of her, ever sharing anything about her time in camp. I must have been 8 or 9 years old, aware of this thing called camp that my folks and folks in my community had sort of talked about, but very unaware and unable to comprehend the immense injustice of it, the weight of it. Something big and awful had happened, and nobody talked about it, but they fought a lot, and they drank a lot, and the silence and silencing took on its own shape, which is what happens in households that shelter the ghosts of inherited trauma. Sometimes I tell people that I became a writer to make meaning of my family's experiences, to make sense of all that silence. But looking back, I think it was more primal than that. Becoming a writer wasn't about initially creative expression or publishing books or any of that. It was about control. It was about shoring up a feeling of agency, within myself. Constructing sentences, conjuring stories and poems made me feel in control when the world around me was unstable, unpredictable, and awash in history's ghosts. As a child, expressing myself through poems and stories kept me, in some very real sense, sane, kept me real to myself and alive. Over the years, writing has become more than that. It's become, I would say, my spiritual practice, a way of communing. People say poetry is the language of communion, prose is the language of communication, but poetry is the language of communion. So communing with myself and history and the life world around me and my ancestors, past and future. My grandparents, Alma and Mitsuo, met in the Gila River camp. They were barrack block neighbors. They fell in love, ostensibly, got married during those years, had a daughter, my auntie. Many babies were born in camp. Life began again and again, even as it was closing in. My life became possible because my grandparents met in camp. I remember thinking of and feeling quite close to them, my grandparents, who've been gone from the earth plane for decades now, during those first days and weeks of the pandemic, when we were all locked down in our homes and hunting for eggs and washing our groceries. Life changed in a traumatizing instant. The sun kept setting and rising again. How was this possible? Was that at all close to how they felt, totally bewildered and afraid, learning that they had mere weeks to pack only what they could carry before being sent to prison camps in some of the most uninhabitable environments, all for looking like the enemy? And who is feeling this now? And what is our task in the face of all of it? And how will we endure? Immediately after the 2016 election, I remember texting my friend, the activist Valerie Kaur, "How will we survive this?" And she wrote back, "Art and together," which is what we did, which is what we will continue to do. Make art, tell stories, find each other in the dark. In 2019, I went on a journey that would become the spark for my latest book of poems. My dad and I traveled for the first time to Gila River, Arizona, the site where Alma and Mitsuo and their families, along with 13,000 other Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, were detained from 1942 to 1945. Gila River was one of 2 concentration camps built on Native American reservations. Our guides that day called it a prison on top of a prison. The Gila River Indian community, the GRIC, encompasses the Acamel, Otham, and Peeposh tribes who have been stewards of that land for thousands of years. On the day I visited with my dad, a hot, overcast morning in late May, we were led through the site of the camp by our 2 guides from the GRIC, Mr. Wally Jones and Mr. Cody Cerna. They pointed out the large concrete slabs still present 80 years after the camps had closed, the foundations of mess halls, barracks, and other buildings. My dad, the avid backyard gardener that he is, was especially moved by the remnants of ponds marked by circles of stones, signs of beauty and life. The 4 of us moved through the dusty mesquite and olive trees, sharing stories, asking questions, laughing, wandering, wondering about each other, about the land. When we got back to our Airbnb in Phoenix, I started writing what would become the first of a series of letters to friends, family, elders, ghosts, that would eventually become my 3rd book, epistolary poems expressing a desire to make sense of my time in the desert with my dad and make sense of the layers of history in that beautiful, fraught place. One morning in late January of 2020, right before the world would change in ways we couldn't have imagined, I held a writing workshop at my kitchen table with my parents and 2 elders from our community who were survivors of the camp in Jerome, Arkansas. I gave them the letters I had written them, and I asked them to read them, and then I asked them to write me back. Like many of my English students at Fresno State, they stared at me blankly, resistant to the task, but trapped. I had them trapped. And what emerged from that morning's writing left me breathless. That eventually, my father's letter became the final piece of writing to close my book. In it, he references our trip to Gila. "What's ironic, Bryn," he says, "my parents wanted to forget this place, but I want to remember it." Art and together, from silence to story. I learned recently that my grandfather, Mitsuo, aspired to be a writer. I had no idea. What would he think of all this? When completing the edits on my book, I had a dream about my grandparents. They showed up at my house. They dropped their suitcases on my front porch. 80 plus years later, and they were finally coming home from camp. They seemed, for the first time, happy. These days, when I reflect on the wisdom of the ancestors, my Japanese and Korean elders, yes, but also my spiritual ancestors, my poetry ancestors, my political ancestors, I do think about what they endured and the courage it took to endure it. But more so, I think about their deepest dreams and desires for themselves, for their children, for me. I try to fill into their desires, their feelings, all that went unexpressed, all that went underground because they needed to survive. What kept you alive all those years, writes the poet Liang Li, keeps you from living. I want to live. I want to believe they want us to live, to write, dream, change, to feel, to tend to all that makes us human, to remember our humanity, the full wild scope of it, as dark as these times are, to find each other in the dark, to reach out our hands to one another as hard as that feels. I believe they are here, loving us forward into a future we may not live to see, but we must imagine is possible. And believing this makes me weep, which grounds me and fortifies me with light. "You, my own deep soul," wrote the Austrian poet Rilke, "trust me. I will not betray you. My blood is alive with many voices telling me I am made of longing. What mystery breaks over me now? In its shadow, I come into life. For the first time, I am alone with you, my power to feel." In the mornings, these past couple of weeks, I've been sitting for 30 minutes in silence in the dark before dawn as a way to be alone with my power to feel. In the fertile silence, I can sense an ancestral wisdom guiding me. And lately, this guiding presence has taken the form of my Korean American grandmother, Marilyn O., whose life story is for a whole other sermon, and whose light infuses me with a love that fortifies me, strengthens me, so that I will no longer abandon myself or abandon the world. I want to close with a few more lines from Rilke, the poet. And before I do, thank you again for the work you're doing in this church, in this community. I feel so inspired just every moment of just this morning and the messages, and it's just fueling me, it's fortifying me. And so I thank you. You are truly a light. You are really a light here. And I was telling Reverend Tim, I used to kind of run by here and see the BLM sign and the flag and the colors, and it would just really keep me going, I think, through this last decade especially. So I'm just so grateful for you, and thank you to Ruth for connecting me with this community this morning. So here's a little Rilke to close. "God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing. Embody me. Flare up like a flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. Thank you. Thank you so much.